So before we begin, let's go ahead and just set our motivation again. We're not going to do a full meditation this time, but just spend a moment in quiet and reconnect with that idea of being here, kind of starting with yourself. Again, expanding the circle of concern as we've been talking about, trying to be here for all beings so that they all have the well-being that is kind of their birthright. They eventually can develop all the qualities and various facets of their life that will be useful for them, that will help them to have a deeper happiness and well-being. And just generate that thought again of universal compassion, universal concern. Okay, let's go ahead and start with Barbara's question. If Barbara is ready to ask her question or comment or whatever it was.
It's more of a comment, Genda. And thank you, by the way, for your teaching. Just fabulous for me. Thank you. My comment has to do with the conversation that you were having around Mr. Trump. And I have come to a place where I do want him to be happy and I want him to not suffer. But what I've realized is it's not altruistic at all. In that the reason I want him to be happy and is to change his behaviors because of the discomfort it causes me and his behaviors. It's wanting him to change in a self-serving way. And I just, I've just been sitting with that. Yeah, I've just been sitting with that. And I would like to get rid of the self-servingness that I'm really feeling with my wanting him to be happy and to be free of suffering.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you sharing that because again, it's okay to start where we are. If really what we're looking at is someone else hopefully changing so that we won't be as discomfortable or uncomfortable, we will have kind of a better state of well-being because the other person isn't doing what they're doing. Well, that's okay to start there and to recognize that we're a suffering sentient being too. Have that self-compassion that really doesn't want us to deal with the discomfort of having someone leading our country and the uncertainty that comes with that when they're, dictated by different things than what should be ideal. But then just to be able to eventually extend it to others and think about the relief, the lack of discomfort that others will have on the basis of that, and try to make it more universal slowly, so we can think about those in our immediate circle who will also benefit from that, and then extend it out so that it becomes a bit more universal. It's not just about ourselves, but having it about ourselves is where it has to start, I think. We have to look at it and go, well, this is not a great place for me to be in. This is not something I want to continue to experience. Therefore, I would like to see it change and wish for that being to have that change, to become happy, to be free from suffering. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's okay to start there.
Well, and I go to universal karma. We've created. But then I also go to over half of the country, look at it differently than I do. So I'm trying to find common ground there. And I guess where I end is good news, bad news, who knows? And that's the best I can do right now.
Right, I understand, Barbara. And I think that is the one thing, is that we don't get too caught up in however we might be perceiving it, because things don't really have an inherent quality of being good or bad anyway. I mean, this is what I'm going to talk about starting on December 1st. I'm just doing 3 classes on this topic of how do we work with difficult situations, problems, suffering, transform them into the path, and so there's always teachings. That's the wonderful thing about Buddhism. No matter what's going on, there's always something we can do to apply the teachings. But so yeah, just be patient with ourselves while we're dealing with our own crazy minds and what have you, and recognize that whatever's going to happen, it's all grist for the mill. So, but it is sad. I mean, this is where part of my distress around the election was personal, of course, who doesn't have a personal take on it, where we look at ourselves. And I don't want the stress of 4 more years of like every day wondering what's going to happen. It was such a relief to have someone else in office who wasn't that way, right? I mean, not saying he was the greatest thing since sliced bread, but he had certainly, there wasn't that element. And yet, I also just, my heart breaks for the people who are going to suffer because of some of his actions and the actions of the people in his cabinet. And so I try to, extend it out that way and just think that, yeah, it can start with myself, but it can become much bigger. Let's get the microphone to June, sorry. But they can't hear you online, June. That's okay.
With all its faults, I love this country. I don't want this country to even, I mean, that's a separate thing, and I know that's attachment to my country, but I love this country, and I don't want to see it go down the tubes like this.
No, yeah.
It's
No, I understand.
just,
Yeah. And I mean, love this world, love all the beings in this world, that we can extend it to, all these different levels, because it's, again, his actions are also going to have an impact on other beings in this world, not just this country. So we try to just, again, it's those two things. We keep our intention really pure, keep our minds as clear as possible in terms of what we're really looking at, and not try to generate hatred and all these other delusions that are going to be problematic. And then we do what we can from that place of good intention. Means you might have to call Washington more frequently. You might have to go to marches. You might have to even be arrested for civil disobedience. I mean, and some of us may not want to do that, but that may be what it takes. So I think we just have to kind of be prepared for what might be entailed in helping to make it through this. It might be a lot, but back to our subject at hand with secular ethics, what we're really focusing on here is what are the guiding principles, the values that are going to be underneath all of that. And as we saw, I mean, compassion is really a key part of it. And as much, it was wonderful that Space brought up, not having compassion for our future president, but we have to have a universal compassion for it to work in some way. We have to see that we're all suffering, and due to the fact that we're dealing with these crazy minds and what have you. And this is more of a Buddhist perspective, but I think even from a secular perspective, you can see that we're all part of what's happening, certainly in regard to this planet and the changes that we're having in our climate, and what's going on in terms of migration of peoples from parts of the world to other parts of the world, and the financial stress that's going on and everything. I mean, we're all dealing with it. Even the billionaires are dealing with to some degree. I don't know. It's a tough one. I wish there were easy answers. You just have to kind of sit with that place of not knowing, as Barbara was saying, maybe it'll be good, maybe it'll be bad. I mean, maybe this 4 years or however many years his presidency lasts, I don't know. Maybe I'm being optimistic even with that comment. But maybe that'll be what it takes. Maybe that'll be where things do start moving back to some sort of normalcy. I don't know. Anyway, one thing I realize that I haven't been doing is I haven't been introducing you to these little practices as we go through this. Again, there is a document which will be coming on the screen right now, just so you know this. Send this to Venerable Dundrup and he can put it out there. It's called the Study Guide for Beyond Religion that I mentioned earlier. Again, 33 pages, 37 in the PDF file, but again, of content, it's actually about 33 pages that you can use. This is the document that I put together with some practices, and let me just review those for the first 4 parts since we finished those in the morning session. For the first one, keeping inner values present. This is a practice that I think helps us to just recall what it is that are our guiding principles. Envision what it would be like to maintain your own values throughout the day, because that's the challenge. We might get them when we get up in the morning, or when we might sit and do some meditation and would be really in touch with compassionate and being compassionate towards all these beings. And then we get up off our cushion and our mind goes the other direction. And then recall inner values with a relaxed and focused mind, both during meditation and while taking actions or making decisions in daily life. So first envision what it would be like to do that, and then actually try to do that. Part 2, this was again about our shared humanity. See others whom you meet or think about in terms of their common humanity, and that can be that, whatever ways that we were talking about, the mental qualities that we have, the rational thought, the empathy that we possess, what have you. And then also the second bullet point, reflect on the ways that others are equal and the same as you, particularly in their fundamental desire to be happy and to not suffer. And that will help propel some of the compassionate motivation that can be behind that. And then part 3, genuine happiness, how you envision genuine happiness, reflect on that. And then assess for yourself the role that these factors play in cultivating genuine happiness. We touched on these, right? Inner peace of mind, a sense of purpose beyond oneself, a connection to others. Again, these things that are all part of a deeper state of well-being rather than just our superficial experiences of happiness. And then part 4, enacting compassion. Look for daily opportunities to practice that. Compassion in action, having compassionate thoughts. Also notice times when compassion is lacking and noting the effects of a lack of compassion on yourself and those around you. Sometimes those are good to pay attention to when we aren't actually doing what we would like to do. And then we can, be more attentive to what we might do differently. But it is important to see the effects that a lack of compassion has in our world, and in our own lives. And that's how we're going to make changes, is when we begin to see that if we do it better, then things will get better. So any questions or comments then up to this point? So now what we do is we're going to move on to the next section, which has to do with this idea of discernment, which is more the wisdom side of things. Again, in Buddhism, we often talk about compassion and wisdom as being sort of these two sides or two wings. They often use this analogy of like a bird needs two wings to fly where it's going to go. In Buddhism, we use the wing of compassion and the wing of wisdom. And the idea is that we need this kind of the juice, the energy of this compassionate motivation to keep things going. But we need to make sure that we're steering in the right direction through wisdom, through some discernment, through some ability to look at things more accurately and therefore more effectively, because we're in line with how things actually are. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of discernment, because this does make a huge difference. We just kind of go about things without thinking about the effects of our actions, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. So His Holiness says, while sound, compassionate motivation is the foundation of ethics and spirituality, a further factor is crucial if we are to achieve a balanced and genuinely universal system of ethics. And again, this is this factor of the kind of wisdom side, the discernment. While intention is the first and most important factor in guaranteeing that our behavior is ethical, we also need discernment to ensure that the choices we make are realistic and that our good intentions do not go to waste. I'll use a really mundane example of this. Like there was, in the South, there's this plant called kudzu. You know of kudzu, right? Yeah, it's like become a pest in the South. And they brought it in originally for some like retention of ground or something. Does someone have some knowledge? Kudzu. Kudzu. I'm sorry, I said kudzu. It's kudzu. Yeah, kudzu. I don't know why it was brought in. It was brought in to maybe for soil erosion or something like that. So you have this kind of, that's a kind of compassionate motivation, right? We don't want floods. We don't want things to be hazardous in our environment. So we bring in this other thing without the discernment of whether this was really healthy for the environment. And so then it proliferated, and now you've got kudzu everywhere, and you've got this whole new problem that has come about. This is just, again, a mundane example. But that's what happens when Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche used to call this idiot compassion. If you have this compassionate motivation, but the things that you do with it aren't grounded in wisdom, then it's idiot compassion. And it may go right sometimes out of just luck, but it can go wrong an awful lot of the time because we're not really doing what should be done or what is ideal to be done. So this is the idea behind this. Go back to the slides and talk a bit more about the role of discernment then. So His Holiness proposes 2 tasks involved in cultivating wise ethical behavior. So the first one is establishing inner values through investigation that can act as general guidelines in everyday life. And that's what we've been mainly focused on so far today. We're going to revisit it at the end of the day and talk about a few more inner values that would be useful. But that's where it starts, right? Is you have to have that intention, that good motivation. All of our actions have consequences, and these inevitably have an impact on both ourselves and others. Since in everyday life, we constantly have to make small decisions which have this ethical dimension, it is very helpful to have basic ethical rules or guidelines to fall back on. So if we're constantly looking back at, is this in line with compassion? Am I being compassionate? Am I being kind? Am I being who I want to be right now in line with my values? That's absolutely an essential part of it. We need to use our discernment, though, to gain understanding about the benefits of certain kinds of behavior and the negative consequences of other kinds. In this way, we can develop an internalized value system to guide us in our responses to everyday life. So it can't just stop, it doesn't stop at having the good intention. We need the discernment to go on to do that. And that's the second factor, dealing with dilemmas using inquiry and discernment. So, living your life ethically according to this system doesn't mean just, having that good thought that you start every day with and then hoping that you're going to be fine just following that. It means you have to actually look at how is that being executed as you go about your daily decision making and the things that you do. It makes sense. And as I keep pointing out, His Holiness still keeps going back and grounding things in basic Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist understanding. But I don't think that there is a universal quality to a lot of this. It makes sense. We even use this phrase in English, right? Of the head and the heart, right? You need both the head and the heart. You have to have a good heart to be involved and, kind of involved with things and caring about things. But you need your head too. You need the intellect, the ability to discern more accurately what is the right thing to do on the basis of having a compassionate response. Otherwise, you end up with these dilemmas, these problems. You might think you're getting rid of a problem, but you may be creating more because you actually haven't discerned things more correctly. So, while internalized values are indispensable as practical tools for living ethically, there are unfortunately exceptional circumstances in which such general principles are inadequate. Particular situations may present themselves in which we are forced to choose between principles we hold dear. This often happens too, where there's a dilemma. Well, I hold this valuable and I hold this valuable, but I know that there are going to be very different results depending upon which of those I hold true to. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. It is in such cases that the use of discernment in service of our compassionate motivation becomes crucial. For only by assessing the consequences and weighing the pros and cons of different courses of action can we come to a balanced conclusion about which course of action is most beneficial. Fortunately, we live in an age where we've got, in terms of a lot of what goes on in our world, the domain of inquiry that exists in science and other disciplines that are very much about looking at the consequences of the actions that we're doing. We don't have the foresight yet to be able to always know that, but that is an important part of making sure that the decisions that we make are going to lead to the best result. So this is what's being addressed here is the need for us to do that at whatever level of decision making that we're engaged in. As it becomes more complicated, like when we start talking about things like climate change and everything going on in our world from that vantage point, it's quite difficult, right? To see what will be the benefits or the effects of doing particular things. I know there's some scientists that are really working on ways to absorb some of the carbon dioxide that's in the environment that's a big factor in causing all the climate change. And they're looking at various things that will eat the carbon dioxide or do all these things. And I'm all in the back of my mind, I'm always like going, is this another kudzu? Is this another, where we're going to have something else in the world that how we're going to have to deal with the side effects of having that? So you can have some level of foresight, but at least to engage in some sort of level of inquiry, some sort of investigation. So the Dalai Lama, when he's dealing with kind of a dilemma or a decision that he needs to make. He has 5 questions, and these are in the slide, but they're also on the 14th page of the study guide that you're going to have access to once I get Venerable Dundrup to put that out there. Again, I apologize for not having that out there earlier. The first one is, do I truly have others' well-being at heart? Just check your motivation. As was said previously by the Dalai Lama, that's where it starts, is do you have a good intention? If it's really self-serving, if everything that you're about is only meeting my own needs and it has nothing to do with the needs of others, and you're going to probably step on other people's toes, well, maybe you need to adjust your intention. Is your intention having the well-being of everyone involved, not just others, but yourself and others? Number 2, am I being influenced by disturbing emotions? Anger, hostility, impatience. Sometimes those factors can, have a big bearing on what it is that we do, and then, of course, the consequences of our actions. We're going to talk a little bit about some of these destructive emotions later today. What are the deeper conditions and causes of the dilemma? Of course, this takes quite a bit of investigation, right? In terms of a very simple thing that's going on with maybe one person or something, we might be able to discern more clearly. But this might prompt us to ask more questions, to do more inquiry, right? Because sometimes we don't know the causes and conditions of what's going on. And even if you take, like I said, just something a problem you're having with a friend, where you've got some issues, things that you're battling over, do you really know what's driving the other person? Have you really sat down and talked with them and heard things from their side? Do you have an understanding that includes their vantage point, rather than being firmly grounded in your own perspective that is really just your view? So this is, again, some of these questions do prompt some deeper actions that we might have to engage in order to make sure that we have the proper discernment. And then the 4th, what choices do I have and what are their probable outcomes? Again, in a very limited very small case where we don't have so many variable factors, that might be easy to determine. Might say, okay, what happens if I don't ever talk to that person again? Well, what's the probable outcome of that? What happens if I go and apologize to that person? What happens if I go and whatever? I mean, you think about the various things that you could do, take the time to investigate them and see what the outcome might be. And we have, again, a greater check-in, a greater knowledge and wisdom potentially of what we might be possibly doing. And then the 5th one, which actions are likely to yield the biggest benefit for others in the long run? And recognizing that though we do care about ourselves and we do want to have compassion for ourselves, our needs, if we're solely guided by our needs and we are mainly concerned with what we're going to get out of transactions with others and being with others, there's going to be something askew there. It's not going to lead to the best possible result. Again, I can't help but go back to Buddhism, where we identify that mind of being solely focused on our own needs as what we call self-cherishing or self-centeredness. And the Buddha says it's one of the most heinous mindsets that we have. It's essentially being concerned about me, myself, and I, and all of my needs, and neglecting the welfare of others, the needs of others. And this is how most people in the world are operating. And it's what's led us. We were talking over lunch break about, why are we in the dilemma that we're in? And how would you possibly ever get out of it when you've got, this perpetual engine of people being self-concerned, having a very selfish motivation. And we all have it to some degree. They say they're at a very subtle level that keeps you focused on your own kind of deeper states of well-being compared to others. So it's, again, something that we have to be aware of. Part of our equation, as His Holiness was pointing out in that 5th question, is looking at, is this having a greater benefit for everyone involved? Or is it only going to benefit me? Or is it only going to benefit a select few that I care about versus other people that I don't care about? I think the problems we're having politically in this country are driven by self-centeredness, by people not being able to see, well, what is it like on the other side of the fence? What are the consequences of policy decision-making and whatever that we're doing at a governmental level? What are the effects that are having on people who are not in our camp, who are maybe going to be suffering worse on the basis of these decisions? So again, discernment plays a great role, especially when we start talking about, the benefits or again, even being aware of the disadvantages of the decisions that we're making and trying to follow this advice here, yield the biggest benefit for others in the long run through the decisions that we make, the actions that we take. So those 5 questions, I think, are really quite useful. Again, it means we have to have them there as something that guides us. It means we do have to spend a little more time. A lot of our decision making is very spontaneous. But discernment, His Holiness says, then, is crucial if we are to have a realistic understanding of the world we live in, and again, at whatever dimension that is. The world you live in terms of your immediate household, greater community, state, country, world. Here, the key principle we need to grasp is that of interdependence. So recall interdependence. Coming back around, I told you it would. These are the second of the 2 main factors that are the pillars of secular ethics. Our shared humanity, and recognizing that, and of course, the compassion that is a response to that shared humanity, and then the interdependence, whereas discernment is the way that we utilize the reality of interdependence and come to make decisions on the basis of that. This general yet profound principle can be approached at various levels and in various contexts. We have already discussed the interdependence of our own well-being and that of others. Right? We've spoken to that earlier today in the discussion we had. Every situation we face in life arises from the convergence of a great number of contributing factors. So taking a broad view is essential if our responses are to be realistic. It's not enough to look at any given situation or problem from only one perspective. I mean, here I like to use sometimes the gun violence issue in the United States in particular, though I'm sure there's other parts of the world, maybe not as bad, but certainly where gun violence is an issue. We have a tendency in our culture to pinpoint one thing and say, if we do that, then the gun violence problem will go away. Well, maybe we're not that naive, but we think it'll certainly be lessened. But one thing is not contributing to gun violence. There are many factors contributing to gun violence, right? We know it's a very, very complicated issue. We were talking earlier about climate change, an incredibly complicated issue, right? There's so many factors playing into that. So if we don't have an awareness that there are many things that are contributing, these just different causes and conditions that are behind the scenes that are manifesting in a particular dilemma or problem that we have, then we're going to make unwise decisions because we're going to think, oh, if I press that button down, well, then everything's going to cease. And that probably is not going to be so. You might have certain things that if you do will have a greater impact for the moment. But then if you haven't done some of the other things, you're probably going to still face those problems once more. And this is the complication that we deal with in a world like this where interdependence is so great. It's just a reality that His Holiness is wanting us to hold some cognizance of so that we don't make decisions just from one perspective, just looking at it and saying, well, this is the only thing that needs to be addressed. Oops, sorry. The fact is, every incident we encounter comes about as a result of countless different causes and conditions, many of which are beyond any individual's control, and some of which may even remain hidden altogether. I think this is one of the things that we haven't even dealt with in our society is how many of these causal factors are hidden to us because we just haven't looked there. We just haven't tried to see what's going on that's causing the political discontent or whatever is we're talking about. Of course, no matter how hard we may try, human discernment is always incomplete then, right? Because we may not be able to be aware of everything involved. There's always bound to be some element of uncertainty. This uncertainty is another reason why ethics must be grounded at the level of motivation, rather than purely on consideration of consequences. The fact is, the consequences of our actions are often not within our control. So he's just reiterating that you start with the grounding of compassion, and you say, this is at the basis, the value, the key value that I'm going to hold that will be the guideline for how I make decisions. Then I make those decisions with some level of discernment, recognizing that not everything's going to be in my control, or whatever body is making this decision, to be able to have that awareness and the control over the results of what's going to happen. But you at least do the discernment and the investigation so you have some understanding. And we do have a tendency to sometimes skirt over that and just start doing things without really thinking about what effect they might have on others. So these two together will assure that there's at least some method for how we go about making ethical decisions in our world. And if we keep it grounded in compassion, then we're going to have a greater likelihood of the outcome being somewhat positive. No guarantee, though. I mean, I think about, again, our world, it's very, very, very complicated. But if we lack the compassionate motivation, I mean, you could do something like, oh, well, let's get rid of, if it's too much for the planet to survive with nearly 8 billion human beings on it, well, then let's get rid of half of the population, right? That could be I mean, I'm not saying that I'm proposing that. I'm just saying that someone could look at it with a lack of compassion and think that the best decision, and I even wonder, I mean, this is a big aside. I sometimes wonder if AI, now that we have artificial intelligence, it's being incorporated into our everyday things, it may look at humanity at some point and see that we're a blight or a pestilence on this planet, as opposed to the main beings who are living and sort of trying to, I don't know, kind of function within this world. But we have to kind of, again, keep those two together. If you don't have the compassionate ground where you're looking at it and trying to relieve suffering, then anything you do from the discernment side could be flavored in a very, very different way, because it's not necessarily looking at all the other factors that are, again, more on that side of it, the heart side of it, only looking at the head side of it. Okay. So where we do have control then is at the level of our motivation, which again is grounded in our inner value, particularly of compassion, and in deploying our critical faculties, our discernment. When we combine these two elements, we can assure that we are doing our best, which is really all that we can do. I mean, the world's so incredibly complex. We can't do better than just our best. We can't be perfect. It's just not going to happen, right? So when I go back and kind of combine these then, and this is how His Holiness even presented, the two pillars for secular ethics, which are in boldface there, shared humanity and interdependence, the shared humanity is embodied within our motivation of compassion. When we recognize that we're all in the same boat together, that we are all fundamentally the same, that we all have that same core human emotions and values and what have you, then we can generate the motivation of compassion in response to that. Again, this isn't just compassion in a light way. This is universal compassion, the compassion that embraces all beings. Then the understanding of interdependence, that other pillar, makes us, have greater discernment, so that we are wiser in our decision-making process, so that we actually are investigating things before we go running from that place of compassionate motivation. So these are very much interconnected, these two pillars, the two sort of responses that we have to them that are within the recognition and understanding that those exist. This is again, as I said, very grounded in Buddhism. Don't get me wrong. It's not like His Holiness is presenting something that's not outside of Buddhism necessarily. But I think the way that he's framing it, the way he's putting it forward, makes it a good foundation for secular ethics. Okay, let me see if there are any questions or comments on that before I go to the next section. Anyone? So we haven't gotten to the actual sort of advice on ethical behavior. We're going to get to that soon. The next section is where we deal with kind of some of the tools and the things that will be useful for us in terms of this adopting these foundations of secular ethics. But I hope this makes sense to people. Again, it's very much Buddhism. I'm not trying to sell it as something that isn't grounded in Buddhism, and I think His Holiness would not want it to do that anyway. He knows that from his own experience. But I think there is a more secular approach to it in this context. If we look at the world that we live in, we have to start making decisions from the foundation of compassion. And everyone has some modicum of compassion, right? I don't think there is a being on the planet who lacks compassion in its entirety. Their compassion may still be for a select few individuals that they care about, that they have some investment in or what have you. And it may still be somewhat biased in that regard. But they still know the taste of compassion. They know the desire for someone to not suffer. So that's a universal value that we can extend to a greater degree. And then the discernment, the ability to use our human intellect to investigate things. This is really, again, something that we use in science and in technology all the time. We just have to use it better to understand as much as we can the complications of the world that we live in, to be able to make decisions from that vantage point. But it starts making decisions in my own little circle, thinking about what are the ramifications if I were to act this way, if I were to do something else. We can do that, but we often don't do that. That's why we need more tools. That's why we need the next set of tools, which is what His Holiness calls ethical mindfulness. So that's the next section. So His Holiness outlines many of the problems we're facing in this age. We've already talked about some of these: environmental degradation and climate change, technological progress that is devoid of human values, war, violence, and terrorism that just keep going on, right? We're caught in that vicious cycle. Greed, income inequality, and excessive materialism. And then finally, political corruption and narrow self-interest on the part of nations and ethnic groups. We still live in an age where all of these things are definitely happening. If human action can create these problems, he says, in the first place, then surely we humans must have the capacity as well as the responsibility to find their solutions. The only way we can put them right is by changing our outlook and our ways and by taking action. So he's kind of beginning to move in the direction of how do we actually do things that are going to be driven by this view of secular ethics? How do we actually try to rectify the situations, the problems, the difficulties we're facing in this world? In this age of globalization, the time has come for us to acknowledge that our lives are deeply interconnected and to recognize that our behavior has a global dimension. When we do so, we'll see that our own interests are best served by what is in the best interests of the wider community. I mentioned this earlier. I don't think there's anything new. In the light of our current times, when schools are not apt to educate children in ethics, His Holiness suggests that we need to find a way to provide such education that is unbiased and inclusive. I want to just take it off screen for a moment to talk about this. This is one of the subjects that we got into over lunch as well. I know there's been some success in some countries in being able to adopt some forms of meditation, mindfulness, these sorts of practices that are in a contemplative vein that, again, are not unique to Buddhism. They exist in many different contemplative traditions. But to be able to adopt them in a public school format, and the complication that has in the United States, where there's a lot of people who would probably take issue with that happening, thinking that we're trying to make people too woke, or we're trying to bring in spiritual traditions from Eastern cultures or whatever. And, all of this, I mean, in the US, it just gets so complicated because people get so sensitive to all these various things. But in some countries, they have had some success with this. But, this is how we're going to make a change, is if we are able to bring this information, this understanding, this training into the minds, especially of younger people who are going to grow up using these tools. I mentioned earlier, where do people learn ethics? And we look at your own experience. And when many of us who were a bit on the older side, when we were growing up, there was probably, again, because of a different world, we were learning things in different ways. Where are people learning ethics now? Where is it that they are actually, gaining some awareness of the ramifications of their behavior, and necessarily then taking some responsibility for addressing their behavior and their mindsets that lead that? So we have to find a way to provide that education that's unbiased and inclusive. So what is required, he says, is a way of promoting inner values which is genuinely universal, which can embrace without prejudice both agnostic humanist perspectives and religious perspectives of various kinds. Ethics is not simply a matter of knowing. More important, it is about doing. For this reason, even the most sophisticated ethical understanding, if it is not applied in daily life, is somewhat pointless. So he's just emphasizing again that whatever way we try to approach introducing a more secular ethics, more universal concern, we have to ground it in not just knowing about it, but to apply it in our lives, actually make it a place of action. Living ethically requires not only the conscious adoption of an ethical outlook, but again, that commitment to developing and applying inner values in our daily lives. So, regarding how to put it into practice, we need to have some understanding of what is entailed in that, so that however we decide we're going to bring secular ethics into the lives of others, we have some idea of these, what he calls here, 3 aspects or levels, each progressively more advanced and dependent for its success upon the others. This is where we're going to get into the other handout that I have for you, where we're going to talk a bit about these 3 levels of ethics that we can begin to introduce in some form of a secular context. The base of the pyramid here, of this triangle, is the ethic of restraint, described here very briefly as refraining from doing actual or potential harm to others through our physical actions, our speech, or even our thoughts. We're going to talk about that first. The second one is built upon that. If we don't have a good ethic of restraint, if we aren't refraining from harming others, well, then it's very hard to think about really cultivating more positive attitudes and helping others, as we're going to see in the final one. The ethic of virtue is actively cultivating positive inner values and behavior. It's on the basis of having some grounding in non-harmfulness, not harming others through our actions, which in Buddhism we refer to as ahimsa, this term that is essentially an equivalent of compassion. It is not harming others through our actions. Then we can cultivate some more positive inner values and behavior that builds upon that. And then finally, we can become more concerned about others and serve them through the ethic of altruism, dedicating ourselves genuinely to the service of others. As I mentioned last Sunday, Geshe Sherab went through the Bodhisattva's practice of ethics, and it has 3, not identical, but similar levels. It starts with the ethic of refraining from negativities, goes on to talk about engaging in the more positive actions, and then benefiting others. These are, again, given different names here, but it's the same principle. We have to start with, not harming other beings. It's where everything begins, right? If we aren't doing negative things to other beings, then we've got a kind of a calmer mind to begin with. If we stop and refrain from those sorts of actions, then we're going to have the ability to build more positive qualities. And how can you possibly develop compassion if every day you're harming other beings? This doesn't seem possible. So stop the harm, then develop the compassion and the deeper qualities, and then have that become an extension as to how we are in the world and benefiting other beings. So that's the idea behind this. So let's go to my other handout. I don't know if I have anything more in the slides. Let me check on introducing this. Well, I'll say what His Holiness says here. To be effective, these 3 stages must be considered in relation to all our behavior. In other words, not just in relation to our outward physical actions, but also in relation to what we say, and ultimately to our very thoughts and intentions. So the ethic of restraint. Let's go on to the handout on that. Again, this was the second one that I put out there that Venerable Dundra put in the folder. And this is how to live a good life. This document called, whoops, I'm sorry, that didn't mean to do that. 3 stages of ethical development. And there's the page references if you do want to go to the book and have a bit more on it. But the very first one, ethic of restraint. This includes avoiding certain kinds of obviously harmful behavior that are identified as such by all the world's major faiths and even the humanistic traditions, such as murder, theft, inappropriate sexual conduct, such as rape and so on, which are by definition harmful to others. So essentially, even in our governments, most governments have laws against these sorts of things, right? You can be arrested for them and be prosecuted on the basis of having committed these sorts of things. And these are good to have in place because these are very definitely and obviously harmful behavior. Then the second bullet point, however, the ethic of restraint calls for avoiding more than just those that are obviously harmful, since not all our actions are immediately violent, but still could endanger others' welfare. I'm going to emphasize this a little bit because I think that, I've been doing some workshops as well. I'm actually going to do one on Tuesday for First Presbyterian Church, and I would like to ideally do them here at the Norbuling. It's a workshop that's been put together by myself and a few other people called Exploring Nonviolence. And the idea behind it is that we need to see that there are many facets and ways that we can approach becoming more nonviolent, be having that be our default mode, which again is in line with compassion, all these other values. And as part of that, I've come to understand through what's called Galtung's triangle of violence, that there are many other dimensions to violence that are not that obvious. And this really fits nicely into what we're discussing here and how His Holiness is presenting this. This is the triangle. Don't get this confused with the triangle we were just looking at. This is what's called the triangle of violence in Johann Galtung. He says that obviously there's the one that we refer to as violence every day, right? Like, oh, it's getting so violent in Albuquerque, or oh, it's getting violent in the US, or whatever. We usually mean the direct violence. This is the stuff that we can point to and we can say, oh yeah, there's this harm going on that is, people being robbed, people being stabbed, being whatever, all of this that is quite obviously violence. But that's the visible part of it. We have a lot of invisible ways that we are involved in a violent environment and that we even contribute to that violence. One of them on the lower left there is cultural violence. I mean, you can have cultural aspects of a society that legitimize violence and that create a structure. When we're getting to structural, maybe shouldn't use the word structure, create a culture where violence is against certain peoples is embraced. So again, culturally, we can have this, and certainly the United States was built on some level of cultural violence, on some way of looking at others as being inferior, particularly, again, the First Nation people who were here before them, and so on. There is a tendency to culturally adopt various things, perspectives, and views that create a legitimacy to violence. The other one, structural violence, is of course the structures that we create in society that promote social injustice. Again, this includes things like apartheid in South Africa. It includes some of our racial segregation that happened in the kind of history of this country, where you have kind of a structural way that you approach things so that then people who are disadvantaged are kept in that mode. That's a form of violence. It's not as gross as the violence that we see on our streets or that might happen to us in various times in our lives, but it is a part of a violent society. So I just want to make people aware of that. I'm just doing my little 2 cents of, kind of introducing this idea that violence has a lot more to it than what we consider to be violent behavior. And what we're teaching in terms of this approach to secular ethics speaks to something similar. That we have to be aware of the other effects that our actions are having on others. Can't help but think about what the sense of white supremacy that has gone on in this country for centuries, and that continues to be a factor that many of us might be unknowingly strengthening through behaviors and ways of looking at things and what have you. Again, if we're going to talk secular ethics, then we have to talk about the ways in which some of our mistaken minds and behaviors contribute to problems in our society. So again, in Buddhism and Jainism, this kind of being aware of all the ramifications of our actions is the practice of ahimsa, this word that I introduced you to a short while ago, which is essentially nonviolence toward all living beings. So again, that's kind of hard to live with that as an absolute. Lama Zopa Rinpoche himself, our spiritual director, he said that it is impossible to live in this world and not be in some way complicit with the harm to other beings. Like Venerable Rabina, who often teaches on, she still eats meat. Some of us are vegetarian, some people are vegan. In Buddhism, there's no set rule that you have to be one or the other. But she points out the fact that even those who might criticize those who eat meat because they're killing animals, well, there are many, many, many creatures that are killed producing vegetables, right? Don't have this naive view that you're somehow removed from harm by becoming vegetarian. You're still involved and complicit in some form of harm. Not as gross, perhaps, as what happens to animals when they're slaughtered for their flesh. But, don't be naive around this. So it is impossible, I think, to be completely removed from harming any other beings. But nonetheless, we can live our lives from that vantage point of investigating our actions and trying to be as not involved with harming other beings as we can. Right? Makes some sense. I mean, this is where the whole vegan movement came from to some degree. It is a healthier diet from everything I've heard, but it's been primarily motivated by people who wish to remove themselves from the harm that happens to other beings. And there's, again, lesser harm that they're involved in, but they still are involved in some harm. Don't think that they've gotten away from that by virtue of just changing their diet. So also included in this category of the ethic of restraint is avoiding inflicting harm on others through our careless use of harsh words, as well as through our dishonesty, any slander we might do of others, any divisive gossip. We have a lot of ways that we use our speech to cause problems. Now, His Holiness does introduce these 6 principles from the great Buddhist master Nagarjuna, and I think there's some merit to these being here in a secular context. Avoiding excessive use of intoxicants. We see how problems are caused. I mean, I was really distressed to see that just in my neighborhood at Rodeo and Yucca yesterday, I think it was in the early evening, there was a DWI accident and two individuals are in the hospital, one in critical condition. We see that if you engage in some of these behaviors and get behind the wheel of a car or do something else, you could put other people's lives at stake, right? But it also leads to about a lot of poor decision making too. Alcohol is one of the things that we take as a sort of a discretionary vow. You may not take, you don't have to take it if you don't want to, but avoiding intoxicants, alcohol and such is good because it keeps us often from having bad decision making. When you're under the influence of stuff, you often make decisions that are not the wisest. The second one, uphold the principle of right livelihood, trying to not get your livelihood through means that are harming other beings. Don't be involved in industries that are producing poisons and weapons and things. Try to be as clear as you can in the livelihood that you get. Ensure that your body, speech, and mind are nonviolent. Of course, that's a tall order. That's a pretty big one. Keep nonviolent thoughts even out of our minds. And try to at least start first with our bodies, not doing things that harm others with our bodies. Then maybe we can start curtailing our speech, and then eventually we can tame our minds. And then treat others with respect. I mean, that's a big one for this topic of secular ethics. I think that's at the heart of this shared humanity, seeing everyone with the same eyes, very respectful. Honor those worthy of esteem, such as parents, teachers, and those who are kind. Again, there should be some recognition of those that we depend upon, in particular, who have played a very prominent role in helping us. But also we should have some, honoring of all beings. And that's maybe the last one, be kind to others. Kindness, of course, is an incredible virtue that we all need to have. So again, I think those things will help us to avoid a lot of misbehavior, this ethic of restraint. If we actually follow all 6 of these, then we probably won't engage in those types of behaviors, right? Because we'll be kind to people, we'll treat them with respect, we'll have a particular orientation that's about nonviolence, about non-harmfulness. In addition to the above guidelines, we need a toolkit to help us in our daily effort to live ethically. In Buddhism, we use 3 interrelated factors known as heedfulness, or sometimes carefulness, mindfulness, and introspective awareness, which may also be used in a secular context. So let me go to some slides that talk about these. Maybe I should just talk about them rather than showing the slides, but essentially these 3 do play a role in helping us in our daily life. Conscientiousness, heedfulness. This is this ability to kind of pay attention to what is going on and be somewhat careful. Have an overall stance of caution. The Tibetan term bakyo, often translated as heedfulness or conscientiousness, carries the sense of being careful and attentive. Right? If we're being heedless and just going around doing things once more, we're going to probably do more harm. In the context of living ethically on a day-to-day basis, in my view, the most important meaning of mindfulness, the second factor, is recollection. In other words, mindfulness is the ability to gather oneself mentally and thereby recall one's core values and motivation. Recollection is often a term used for this as equivalent for the Tibetan of mindfulness. But mindfulness is kind of used in our culture in a very wide way, but we're talking mainly about the non-forgetfulness of staying with whatever it is that we are trying to practice. So if we're trying to practice stopping harming others, being less violent in our thoughts, our actions, and so on. Well, then we need to have that recollection that that is what we're doing. That's how we're trying to live our lives. In Tibetan, the word for mindfulness, drempa, also means memory. So it suggests bringing presence of mind into everyday activities. With such recollection, we are less likely to indulge our bad habits and more likely to refrain from harmful deeds. And we do a lot of things because we're not mindful, because we just don't think about it and don't pay attention to what's going on. Awareness, the third one, often called introspection, shishin. This means paying attention to our own behavior. It means honestly observing our behavior as it is going on, and thereby bringing it under control. By being aware of our words and actions, we guard ourselves against doing and saying things we will regret later. So it makes it sound almost similar to mindfulness, but these two work in tandem. We have the general flavor of heedfulness, carefulness that we are trying to abide by throughout our day. As we are going about our actions, we try to stay present with what it is that we are doing in terms of recollecting how we want to be. But we still need this factor of introspection or awareness that checks in to see if we're really staying true to that. Hate to say it, but our minds are pretty tricky things, and we can suddenly find ourselves losing our mindfulness. If that's the case, then we need this awareness that sees that that has happened and corrects our path so that we end up actually having a reestablishment of our mindfulness. We're aware of what we're doing. We are actually engaging in the proper actions and the thoughts behind them that will further our aim, further what it is that we're trying to accomplish, to not fall prey to these negative actions. So having the ability to monitor oneself, having, as it were, a second order level of attention, is of great practical use in everyday life as it gives us greater control over our negative behavior, enables us to remain true to our deeper motives and convictions. So let me take it off screen and go back to the sheet. There also are two other factors that are used in our Tibetan Buddhist approach to working with our mind. These additional factors, that last bullet point, that can aid us in becoming more conscientious in our restraint from harming others, are often called self-respect and consideration for others. You might see them by the names of shame and embarrassment, but I try to steer away from those terms because they're kind of loaded terms. Self-respect means that we're going to have a regard for ourselves so that we don't engage in behavior that's contrary to how we want to be in the world. Yeah. I sometimes point out to people that when I first moved to Santa Fe after studying in Italy to become a teacher, and I become a Buddhist teacher here, and now I'm like walking around doing my everyday stuff in Santa Fe, how like, I want to make sure that I live up to my ideals then, so that somebody doesn't see me as a Buddhist teacher who's going against the Buddhist teachings, which can happen, right? People can do that pretty easily. So again, out of concern for myself and wanting to make sure that I uphold my own principles, I'm going to engage in good behavior, not yell at the person at the parking lot, when they pull into a spot that I thought it was mine or something, but, refrain from that sort of behavior, right? But I also don't want I want to have consideration for others in terms of the reflection that this will have on other people. Because it's not just about me. It's not just about me and what I think, I want other people to see me in some better light. It's that I also don't want to be upsetting to other people. Those people that will be the object of my yelling at them, but also even others that might be harmed peripherally. Because Don, my Buddhist teacher, is out in the parking lot yelling at people, who took his spot. And so I think we can all apply these to our daily lives. Let's go to the slides I've got from His Holiness on these. The first of these, self-respect, relates to having a sense of personal integrity, a self-image as a person who upholds certain values. So when we are tempted to indulge in harmful behavior, our self-image acts as a restraint as we think, this is unbecoming of me. This is not how I want to be in the world. This is not how I want to relate to each other, to other beings. The second mental quality, consideration of others, pertains to having a healthy regard for others' opinions, especially for their potential disapproval. Together, these two factors give us an added level of caution about doing wrong, which can strengthen our moral compass. So again, we've gotten a number of tools there to work with, these three of kind of this heedfulness or conscientiousness, mindfulness, and then the awareness or introspection. And then if we have this foundation of a good sense of attention to ourselves, some self-respect, and then also consideration for others that might be involved in our actions, then we have some of the tools we need to be able to live our lives, hopefully without harming others in direct ways, and maybe even stop harming them in indirect ways. That's the first level of the 3 stages of ethical development. So again, in any way of introducing this, like if you were to talk to other people and want to, bounce secular ethics off of them, this is really the foundation. We have to stop engaging, particularly in those actions that are quite directly harmful to other beings. So we need forces that will kind of keep us back from that. And those were those factors that we looked at, and even Nagarjuna's advice is some of that, the things that we can do. I'm going to maybe just plow through without a break. If you need to stand up and stretch here in the Gompa, you're welcome to do that, or if you even need to use the restroom. But we've only got a half hour left, and I do want to try to at least touch on most of the subjects that we have left. Certainly, if you're online, you can do as you wish to manage and take care of yourself. Ethic of virtue, and this is built upon the previous one, where we have that ethic of restraint. If we can manage to refrain from harming others, we can then start to give more serious attention to actively doing good, which can bring great joy and confidence. So this includes actions such as being generous with others, helping those in need, as well as praising others and offering them advice and encouragement. And one thing that we do in Buddhism often is this last bullet point. We cultivate what's called an attitude of sympathetic joy in others' achievements and good fortune. That's being described here as a useful aid in bringing benefit to others through our words and actions. In Buddhism, of course, this is about creating what we often call our good karma. Making sure that we have a store of merit and a positive energy that we can rely upon going forward, and that is beneficial for ourselves and for others as well, because will keep us moving in that vein. But when we see others who have good fortune in their lives, who have good qualities or good things that they've acquired through their hard work and diligence, we can take some rejoicing in that. We can actually have a sympathetic joy. And in Buddhism, we call this the practice of rejoicing, when it kind of keeps us from having some envy of other people. It often happens in our culture. Everything is so competitive that we get very envious when others have things that we don't have. They have more than we have, and what have you. So if we rejoice in what other people have, if we actually take delight in the fact that they possess good qualities or what have you, then we kind of counteract that envy. And moreover, we create a very positive spin on things. It's really quite useful. So again, I don't know that I need to talk much more about some of these other elements of virtue, but I will share what His Holiness says on this attitude of sympathetic joy is a powerful antidote against envy, which is, again, not only a source of unnecessary suffering on the individual level, because we just sit there with our mind that's jealous of others or what have you, but also an obstacle to our ability to reach out and engage with others, because we think that other people don't deserve what they have, and we might neglect them or might even have hatred towards them. The last one is the ethic of altruism, where we not only engage in kind of positive, virtuous actions that was in the second level, but we become more dedicated to the benefit of all sentient beings. And when we recognize that, and of course in the Buddhist terms, this is what we're reaching for ideally, is to have that ethic of altruism all the time, to be guided by that, and being this genuine selfless dedication of one's actions and words to the benefit of others. And this can be undertaken by anyone, again, not just those in a helping profession, since it simply entails making serving others a priority. So as we go about our day, we're constantly thinking about others and how do we benefit them. I remember Venerable Rabina, again, who, when she came through many years ago and she was teaching on generosity, and she said, if somebody is walking towards you and they're, and someone who's unhoused, they obviously need some assistance and they ask for something, they go, do you have $1 I can spare, that you can spare? Don't think that's somebody else's homeless person. That's your homeless person, right? Her whole point was like, don't get into a place where we're neglecting and avoiding being of service to other beings. Even if we can't, at that moment, we don't have the ability to give them something that will be of use, It doesn't stop us from at least attending to that person, at least hearing them out, at least wishing them well and saying, I'm sorry, I can't help you right now, but I hope that you find what you need at this time or whatever. Having good thoughts towards them. Again, but ideally, this should be how we live our lives, is we're constantly attentive to what are the needs that I could be addressing right now. Not that you can address all of them. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we should become manic about trying to relieve the suffering of the world by just exhausting ourselves. But if things are presenting themselves to you, then there are plenty in our world that are there. It might be just, somebody who has had something happen in their life that's quite traumatic for them, and they might need just to go out for a walk or have tea or do something, then you extend yourself out to do that. And you can see how that depends upon the other two. You got to stop harming beings first. Don't avoid all those negative actions, refrain from that. Secondly, develop some positive patterns that are virtuous, that are more about generating that good energy. And then you can be more attentive in general to the needs of the world as the world appears in your field of vision. So this is, again, 3 levels of ethics that His Holiness points out that I think can be useful as a way of monitoring where we are in terms of our practice of ethical behavior. And once more, I think all 3 of those could be presented in a secular context without too much trouble. I don't know. Let's go to the slides. I think I just had a little bit more to share on the slides. An important part of serving others, this last ethic of altruism, is using discernment to assess the likely consequences of our own actions. So even what we talked about in the previous section or in the earlier part of this about discernment, early part of this afternoon, is, that's how we actually serve others, is thinking about the consequences of our actions. Then by being heedful, mindful, and attentive in our everyday lives, we will begin to gain mastery over our actions and words. And tools that we can use to be able to enact that. This is the very foundation of freedom, and it is through gaining such self-mastery and using it to ensure that our actions are non-harmful at every level that we can start to actively work for the benefit of others. And it does take some effort. This isn't just going to fall into our laps, but we can actually become more altruistic and of greater benefit to others. There's these 3 levels, again, of kind of what he's calling ethical mindfulness or stages of ethical development. And I think I've explained them fairly well. So just want to check in and see if there are any questions about these. That handout, again, is available for you that I went through on the screen as just a guide of various things that can inform your practice of those. No questions, comments? Okay. Again, those of you who are Buddhists, which is most of the people here, then you know that this is the way ethics is taught. Geshe-la went through this last Sunday, right? He said there's the ethics of avoiding non-virtue, then the ethics of engaging in virtue, merit making, and then there's the ethics of benefiting others. In the traditional teachings, they spell out like 11 situations where you should ideally benefit somebody who comes into your field of awareness. So if you have people who are traveling and need a place to stay, or who are distraught at something having happened or are ill, then you attend to their needs. Again, we can't attend always to everyone's needs, but we should have that attitude of really wanting to benefit other beings. This is what makes it a bit more powerful in terms of the bodhisattva practices. Let's go on to the next topic. We're coming to the last few things here. Part 7 and 8 kind of have a combined thing, because obviously we recognize that so much of this still comes down to our minds. While we can engage in behaviors as we just went through, we see that we have obstacles to us being able to adopt some of these behaviors and mindsets, which are what we call in Buddhism destructive emotions or afflictive emotions. And then we also have the key inner values, or the positive emotions that are important to generate. So we can kind of diminish the destructive ones and develop the constructive ones. That's what this last section is about. So he's just saying in this slide that probably the greatest, problem that we have are destructive or afflictive emotions. This is what we were talking about earlier today. Such emotions are the real enemies of human happiness and the ultimate source of all destructive human behavior. Tackling these negative emotions is an important goal of ethical and spiritual practice. Of course, in Buddhism, we know that this is one of the main practices, is to diminish our destructive emotions and to eventually eliminate them, which again, we're not asking everyone in the world to do that, but this is something we have to address for ourselves. Now, how do we define these? They are those states which undermine our well-being by creating inner turmoil, thereby undermining our self-control and depriving us of mental freedom. So destructive emotions aren't just measured on the fact of they cause something harmful to others. They are mainly on the basis that they harm us. They disturb our own mental well-being. They undermine our own ability to have some self-discipline, to be able to know what we're doing and do the proper thing. And we're going to talk more about some of these factors in the Wednesday night course, because these are obviously part of our Buddhist psychology. But again, not to say that they shouldn't be presented in a secular context. Within this, it's also possible to distinguish between two subcategories. Those emotional states that are destructive in themselves, such as greed, hatred, or malice, and those states, such as attachment, anger, or fear, which only become destructive when their intensity is disproportionate to the situation in which they arise. Now, again, those of you who are Buddhists might think, well, but I thought attachment, anger, and fear, well, fear is kind of a mixed one, but might think that these things are absolute and always being destructive. But the way His Holiness presents them, we can see that there are some shades of them that are actually valuable. These are some of the examples of when the three last emotions he mentioned, attachment, anger, and fear, how these can become either constructive or destructive. An attachment that allows us to hold families and communities together, and thus is constructive, opposed to a attachment that wants to control others, and thus becomes destructive. Or we sometimes have attachment in relationships like that. You know, intimate relationships sometimes can become more about attachment, where you're manipulating the other person to get what you want, as opposed to really being genuinely concerned about them. Anger that arises from a compassionate response to injustice in the world, and thus can be constructive, right? We need to have that. As I was pointing out to what Space said earlier, we need to have a force that tries to address injustice and things that might happen in the future or are happening now in our world. That shouldn't be, we shouldn't say, oh, I'm Buddhist and everything's compassion and therefore I can't do these things. We need to confront what is wrong and going astray in our world and make sure that we rectify those things as best as we can. That form of what His Holiness calls anger. Again, in Buddhism, we would usually refer to anger as being the second one that I'm going to put on the screen in a moment. But His Holiness says that this is actually a very benevolent force in our world. It's about creating better conditions for the beings that are being persecuted or whatever the case might be at that moment. So again, I think this is something we need to differentiate. Then the anger that wishes to retaliate in reaction to harm that is done to oneself, which is destructive. Again, we can have a lot of different forms of anger, but we can have it certainly become much more destructive when it becomes more biased, as opposed to when we actually are trying to help others to be free from suffering. Okay, and the last one, fear, also has two dimensions. It enables us to avoid danger and can become constructive. Oftentimes we have this fear. We call this a wholesome fear. If there's something going on, that we need to be aware of, that it's going to be causing us future suffering, well, that's a good thing to be aware of it and to develop some fear or some dread of it. But fear can become obsessive or excessive, thus paralyzing us and inducing anxiety, which is thus destructive. So His Holiness points out these three. And we might see that there are other ones. I couldn't think of any as, in preparing for this, but we have to be careful. Again, what we mean by a destructive emotion is the emotion causes a sense of imbalance within ourselves and causes us to frequently make decisions and do things that are not in line with what's appropriate, what would be the best response, and outside of our intention and motivation often. Whereas there are some where you might have a deviation into becoming more constructive. And those constructive emotions, again, are when we are looking at the bigger picture, when we're holding a greater awareness, when we're not kind of tightly in this space of just me, myself, and I. So again, the tendency is for the destructive ones to kind of be in that vein versus the constructive ones to be more universally concerned, at least to be beyond our own concern, our self-concern. Okay. Often we cannot make this determination only by taking into account the underlying motivation, the specific object of the emotion, and so on. In the area of the human mind, therefore, we should always maintain an attitude of open-mindedness, pragmatism, flexibility. I don't know if I need to say anything on that. Getting back to the destructive emotions, one feature that characterizes them all is a tendency to distort our perception of reality. They cause us to narrow our perspective. Again, let me take it off screen here because I want to talk a little bit about these. If we look at the misbehavior that we engage in when we are not following those three ethics, well, then we are generally creating something that is, again, destructive in the sense of this. I go back to this slide here. Our tendency of distorting reality. Oops, there it is. Okay, I'll put it back on screen in a moment. When we're distorting reality now in Buddhism, we talk about a really, really subtle way that we're distorting reality that becomes the major problem. And we're not going to go to that because, again, that's outside of the context of secular ethics. But what do we mean by just our coarser way of distorting reality? Well, once more, we are looking upon things with a kind of a bias that is contributing to our unhealthy emotion towards that. So when you have something that is happening, like say a neighbor is playing their music really, really loud when you're trying to read a book or something, right? That happens sometimes. I don't know. I'm sure you've all had that in your life at one time or another. I think sometimes I was the noisy neighbor. But anyway, so what you were doing is you were looking at that solely from the perspective of, okay, this is interfering with me and with my happiness. That's the kind of basis. But then you're moreover making it into something much bigger than it actually is. You know, the little bit of discomfort that you might have for however long they might be playing their music is you brought it to this place where it becomes almost unbearable, where you might go over there and yell at this person, or you might even do something to harm their property or to, you know, say something to them that is really inappropriate on the basis of you're making that into this huge, huge issue. Whereas for them, they're having a very different experience, right? They're probably going around their house doing whatever, listening to the music and having a good time, enjoying it. You know, so you are taking it, you are seeing it only through the lens of your own perspective, and you're making it much bigger than it is. This is our tendency to exaggerate things. This is always a part of these destructive emotions, is that we're not seeing reality. We're not looking at things in a very, very in a basic way, understanding them without all the trappings of our own conditioning and our own way of kind of being self-centered. So let's see what His Holiness says on this. Again, I'm going to have to do the slideshow thing here. Let me, oops, didn't mean to do that. Slide shows up. Okay, there we go. Our inner development with regard to regulating our destructive emotion calls for a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, oh, this is kind of moving on. So I didn't include any more slides about this. Let me see if there are any questions about this idea of exaggerating. And those of you involved in Buddhism know that we're doing this all the time. Let's use the other example of like attachment to someone. We've all had a relationship with somebody that we've fallen in love with. And when you fall in love with somebody, there's some love there, but there's also a lot of attachment. You start putting qualities on that person that bring them up on a pedestal, right? So that you start seeing them through the lens of, oh, there's so much that's perfect and wonderful about this person because you're falling in love with them and you're accentuating, exaggerating the positive qualities and only seeing that. That is your view of the person. They become so perfect that they can't possibly live up to that. The pedestal you put them on is so high that they're bound to fall. And what happens over time is that we see the faults, we see the warts, we smell the bad breath, all these things happen, and we start lowering them, and we might even get them down to a place where we despise them, where we look upon them as somebody we want nothing to do with anymore. But that was all there in the beginning. We were only paying attention to and exaggerating the positive qualities, taking them out of whack to what is actually there. And then, of course, the negative qualities, when they appear, we do the same thing. And that's what causes us to lose our love for that person, is because we've now exaggerated the negative qualities and we paint the person as being entirely negative. So that's also another way we can see that happening. That's the problem that we have with this mind of kind of desire that is looking at things from a skewed perspective. So again, why His Holiness is spending so much time on these, destructive emotions is because they are what are frequently causing us to engage in unethical behavior that goes against those three ethics. So as he says, on the one hand, we have to seek to reduce the impact of the destructive potentials that are inherent within us. On the other, we must seek to enhance the positive qualities that also naturally exist within us. So let me just explain these really briefly. We can decrease these destructive emotions by first adopting a stance of opposition to them. In other words, we are opposed to their arising and we do everything we can to be vigilant to make sure that when they are appearing in our minds, that we will have that thought that this is not something that we want to continue to hold. So we need to have this strong enthusiasm, determination for the task. Considering how negative they are, we have to really want to engage in fighting them. Understand their causes, know where they come from. In Buddhism, again, as I said, just explained, one of the biggest causes is the unhealthy way of looking at things, to exaggerate the qualities that they have. Develop emotional awareness. This is how His Holiness describes this. He says, if we are to succeed in effectively tackling our destructive tendencies, we must observe and study them closely. It's not a matter of merely suppressing them. Instead of suppressing, we must be open and honest with ourselves and bring mindful awareness to what triggers them, how they make us feel, what kind of behavior they provoke. This kind of introspective attentiveness to the way these emotions arise within us and manifest in our behavior is what he calls emotional awareness. Only by practicing such awareness, by facing these emotions directly, giving them careful scrutiny, that we can gradually bring them under control. So again, emotional awareness, I can't help but keep referring to the course I'm going to be doing on Wednesdays. That's the goal of that course, is to give us not just emotional awareness, but cognitive awareness, to understand what is going on in our minds and why we have fallen prey to these destructive emotions and engaged in unethical behavior is because we haven't been aware of their arising and knowing what's going on and being kind of involved in the whole process and picking it apart. In fact, they say there are like 6 different causes that give rise to the destructive emotions. We'll look at that as part of that course. We have to understand how the mind functions to really get to know our minds quite personally. That's what Buddhism is all about. That's why some people refer to Buddhism more as a psychology rather than a religion per se. But it's through doing that investigation and work with our minds that we actually are able to change things and eventually free our minds from the habitual patterns that we've had. Because there's nothing really, mentioned them being kind of inherent, but they're not inherent in the sense of being unable to be opposed or changed. The last one is to cultivate attentiveness to catch them as they arise. It is really helpful to catch them early on because then they're quite weak. When they first are arising, we can squelch them pretty easily, just like you would if you were to put out a match compared to putting out a forest fire. It's big difference, right? If we can get them at the beginning and have this attentiveness to see, oh, I see my mind's moving in that direction. So we have to, that's part of what we're going to look at in that course too, is like, what is it that prompts these things to arise? So again, and this is important to see the onset of destructive emotions as a kind of causal chain. It starts with an external stimulus, something that happens, comes into our field of awareness, and it ends with our behavioral response. The aim of emotional awareness is to bring our attention or mindfulness into this split-second process and thereby to gain some control over it. Running out of time. Let me just finish this section and then I'm just going to give you a preview of what's in the final section, and you can read if you'd like, some of the, I will provide these slides to Venerable Dundrup as well, and they're pretty straightforward, the remaining parts of this. But first, when you're dealing with something that is difficult, calm yourself, taking deep breaths, he says, view the situation in a more positive light, think that this is an opportunity to grow. See all the various causes and conditions that might be contributing to it, apply that discernment, And then see it also maybe from, different angles or situations, or, perspectives, that there are different ways of looking at it. Just like as I was talking about the music, your neighbor's playing their music too loud. Well, from their perspective, they're just having a good time, right? They're not trying to annoy you usually. Maybe they might do that if you keep annoying them. But let me just review what's going to be in part 8, these key inner values. Um, Essentially, what we're going to be talking about here is His Holiness identified 4 main values that he feels are really quite useful for us to be able to kind of have some strength of mind to combat the destructive states of mind. Actually, what I can do, maybe what's good is to put that, rather than going through all the slides, I'll put up the other handout that I had because it refers to them. Again, remember that I do have all of these various things that you can utilize as part of your practice. We went through part 5 already on discernment, and that's a repeat of those 5 steps. Actually, I did put that in there. Okay, I'm glad I put that in that handout. I didn't think I had that there before. Then part 6, ethical mindfulness. There's some suggestions there on some things you can practice. Part 7, we just dealt with. When a destructive tendency or reaction comes up, trace it from the external trigger to the internal state of mind. See how quickly you can catch it, and then restrain yourself from acting in harmful ways by exercising the muscle of restraint. Then part 8, there are 4 values again that His Holiness discusses in this section, and they're all they deserve like a whole course in and of themselves. Patience. Patience is the antidote to anger and that kind of frustration that comes up in our lives. If we are more tolerant and able to be with whatever is happening and not be so bent out of shape, then we have a greater composure to work with situations in our life. Contentment, if we're not always having that mind of acquiring things and wanting things to be better and so on. And when it comes to your spiritual practice, you may want to not have contentment and not just sit on your laurel, rest on your laurels, as they say. But in terms of many of the things in our lives, having a mind of contentment is really quite useful. We see that that's kind of the antidote to that greedy acquisitional mind that's always looking for something more, something better. Self-discipline. This is kind of the antidote to some degree to a tendency that we have to be quite lax and lazy in regard to our practice of things. We have to be willing to look at our stuff and to be moving ourselves in a more healthy direction. And then finally, generosity. Generosity, obviously, we see in all religious traditions for sure. It's something that is valued. And even in our culture, once more, we often see the way that we react and respond positively to people who are being generous. So I'm not going to talk more about those because, again, I think they're pretty straightforward and you will have that information if you'd like to look at that. What I'd like to do now, though, is to go ahead and jump to, I might have to go forward quite a bit. Let me get out of that one and go forward on the slides so that you don't get dizzy while I'm showing all these. Okay. So this is where I'm going to start. Let me put the screens back on. There's just a few more passages that I want to read. I'm sorry for all the reading in this, but I do like using His Holiness's words and kind of commenting on them. Not that I can convey the same sense of expertise that His Holiness has at all, but so he says, we have now explored in some detail what spirituality and ethical living entail in terms of personal practice. We have discussed ways to develop greater awareness so that we can learn to regulate our emotions. And finally, some ways to cultivate our inner values, and especially compassion, but then, of course, the 4 that were just mentioned. By mental cultivation, I mean a disciplined application of mind that involves, can I skip a slide there? No. Okay. Wasn't referred there, but essentially we need to kind of cultivate these things day in and day out. So this is referring to deepening our familiarity with a chosen object or theme. And here he says he's thinking of the Sanskrit term bhavana, which connotes cultivation, and whose Tibetan equivalent, gom, I was explaining earlier to Brooke that we call this a gompa. It is used often to refer to the word meditation, but it literally means familiarization. It has that connotation of like we need to become more familiar with what is positive. These two terms, often translated into English as meditation, refer to a whole range of mental practices and not just as many supposed to simple methods of relaxation. The original terms imply a process of cultivating familiarity with something, whether it's a habit, a way of seeing, or a way of being. So what His Holiness is saying here is the closing to all of this, kind of coming to the end of all this, is that we have to actually cultivate a practice around ethical behavior. Don't think that it's just something that you read about and then you'll have it. You have to have some discipline around this. You have to actually engage in what is going to steer you in that better direction for the sake of yourself, but also for the sake of others in this world. So meditation simply means becoming familiar with these ideas. Well, I gave you some practices for all 8 parts of this that you can take home and you can work with and reflect on. And that way you can increase your own understanding and your adoption of those in your daily life. That's the big test, right? If you can think about them on the cushion, that's one thing while you're meditating or reflecting. But as His Holiness says here, how then does this process of mental cultivation lead to spiritual and inner transformation? There are 3 levels of understanding in classic Buddhist theory. First, understanding through hearing or learning, which is superficial, then developed through reflection, which has a deeper conviction, and then that which is derived through a contemplative experience where it becomes internalized. So these are the tools that we are working with. You have to kind of get your head around these concepts and come and sit in a class like this for a day, be exposed to these ideas. That's hearing it. Then you need to think about them. And we can't do that in the course of just hearing them. We get some level of processing. We need to think about them. And that's, again, why I put together some of these instructions. And then by developing a deeper contemplative experience and internalizing them is how we actually change. And as we become more accomplished in our practice, we come more and more to see the trainability of the mind, to begin to substitute the positive thoughts for the negative ones, weaken the hold that our destructive emotions have on us. Essentially, the purpose of the mental training exercises that he's been describing is from the perspective of secular ethics to make ourselves calmer, more compassionate, and more discerning human beings. This is his closing comment at the tail end of it. Within the scale of the life of the cosmos, a human life is no more than a tiny blip. Each one of us is a visitor to this planet, a guest, who has only a finite time to stay. What greater folly could there be than to spend this short time lonely, unhappy, and in conflict with our fellow visitors? Far better, surely, to use our short time in pursuing a meaningful life, enriched by a sense of connection with and service toward others. There's His Holiness. Thank you. Okay. Sorry I had to rush through the last part this afternoon, but again, I was expecting to have another half hour, but since it was advertised as 3, I just have to leave it at that. But any comments or questions from anybody? It was a lot of information too. Like I said, I went through this over like the course of several Sundays and kind of spent a little more time digesting each one. But that's, again, I'm trying to maybe plant a few seeds here, things that you can think about, things that you can investigate. I realize that most of you who are Buddhists often have other things that you've already been receiving teachings on, and so it's kind of challenging to say, okay, now I'm going to dedicate my time to this. But maybe there's 1 or 2 things in there that you can investigate to help your own practice of ethics and to be, again, a tool for helping to bring secular ethics into other people's lives. When you're dealing with people, and I'm sure every one of you has somebody who calls you every now and then and says, I'm really faced with a problem here, can you give me some advice about how to look at this or how to work with this? Well, then you can maybe steer them in the direction of some of these. You don't always have to answer people's questions. Sometimes it's better to give them questions to say, well, but what do you think about this? Or what is it that's really driving you? What is it that is your key value or emotion or something that you want to stay true to throughout this? What do you think is most important? And then maybe help them to adopt some of the ways that we're looking at secular ethics, even that 5-fold questioning thing, right? Are you truly being having others' welfare in your mind and what have you? All these kinds of things are useful. So I hope I've given you some introduction to this idea. I do feel, as I said during the lunch break, that we have a long way to go to being able to adopt this in the United States. as a part of an education program. His Holiness once more has put together this CSEE program. I think it's, I can't remember what the SEE stand for. One of them is ethics. But I'm sorry, I meant to look it up during the break. It's just not something I'm that familiar with. But they have been having some success in some countries bringing that into the school system. But as I said, with everything in this country being a little bit shaky right now, I don't know that these sorts of programs could ever be adopted. But we do see the usefulness of having some sort of secular approach to ethics, hopefully. And each of us may be doing our part to try to bring that into other people's lives. Okay. There are no questions or comments. Let's just have a few thoughts of dedication, like we did at the end of the morning. We're going to do this a little more fully right now by thinking about everything we've done throughout these hours that we spent together today. All the seeds that we planted in our own minds, the good intentions that we've had to be able to benefit others through the knowledge that we are acquiring and the way that we are enacting this in our lives. May this become the cause then for all beings to find the happiness that they seek and to be free from all suffering. And this is the deepest intention that we can hold, to want all beings to achieve their greatest potential through our achieving our own potential and being able to benefit every one of them. It's kind of nice to dedicate for those beings that we're holding in our hearts as well, where we see suffering in the world and those that we know, as well as those that are in parts of the world that we're aware of. We can send this positive energy out to them as well. I think that it becomes a cause to help them alleviate their suffering, help them to have peace, happiness, all the causes of that. And we wish for all beings to have these results through what we've done here today. And we lastly dedicate for the good health and long life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, without whom I wouldn't even be sitting here teaching these teachings on secular ethics. May he continue to be a guiding light in this world for many, many, many years. And then, of course, for all of our other spiritual guides, that they will have good health and long lives, and especially for the quick return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who has again passed away, but will hopefully return in a form that we can benefit from in future time. So thank you all. I'm talked out. So sorry for, thank you for listening to my blah, 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 but mostly sharing His Holiness's words, which again, I think are really quite precious. And if you haven't read Beyond Religion, I do really encourage it. And as I said, I'll get the slides from what I presented to Venerable Dundrup, as well as the study guide, and you can do your own study or study with other folks. So thank you all. Be well.